Sergeant Marcus Thompson carefully adjusted his grip on the leather harness as he stepped off the city bus. His loyal German shepherd, Rex, immediately positioned himself at Marcus's left side, the way he had been trained to do for the past 3 years. The afternoon sun felt warm on Marcus's face as they walked down the familiar sidewalk toward the small apartment complex where he lived. Marcus had lost his sight during his second tour in Afghanistan when an improvised explosive device detonated near his patrol vehicle. The blast had taken his vision but not his spirit. Rex had been his constant companion since returning home, serving as both his guide dog and his closest friend. The bond between them was unbreakable, forged through countless hours of training and daily adventures navigating the civilian world together. As they approached the corner grocery store, Marcus heard the familiar sound of teenagers gathering nearby. Their voices carried across the parking lot, loud and carefree in the way that only youth could manage. He paid little attention to their chatter, focusing instead on Rex's steady pace and the mental map he had created of this neighborhood over the months since moving here. Rex suddenly slowed his pace, a subtle change that Marcus immediately noticed. His four-legged partner had detected something that required caution. Marcus trusted Rex's instincts completely, knowing that the dog's training and natural protective instincts had kept him safe countless times before. The group of teenagers had noticed the pair walking by. There were 5 of them, all from wealthy families in the upscale neighborhood just a few blocks away. They attended the private academy on the other side of town and drove expensive cars that their parents had bought them for their 16th birthdays. These young people had never known hardship or struggle, and their understanding of sacrifice was limited to giving up their phones during family dinners. "Look at that guy with the dog," whispered Jake, the unofficial leader of the group. His designer sneakers probably cost more than Marcus spent on groceries in 2 months. The other teenagers gathered closer, their curiosity piqued by the sight of the military veteran and his guide dog. Marcus continued walking, unaware that he had become the subject of their attention. Rex maintained his professional demeanor, but his ears were slightly more alert than usual. The dog had sensed the change in the atmosphere around them. Though he couldn't yet determine if there was any real threat to his handler, the teenagers followed at a distance, their expensive clothes and confident attitudes making them feel invincible. They had no understanding of what Marcus had endured or the sacrifices he had made for their freedom. To them, he was simply an interesting distraction from their otherwise mundane afternoon of hanging around the shopping center. As Marcus and Rex turned the corner toward home, the teenagers made a decision that would change everything. They decided to follow the veteran, not out of respect or curiosity about his service, but because they thought it might be entertaining to mess with someone they perceived as vulnerable. Marcus had survived enemy fire, explosion, and the challenging process of rebuilding his life after losing his sight. He had learned to navigate the world with Rex's help and had found peace in their simple daily routines. He had no idea that his quiet afternoon walk was about to become something much more complicated. The teenagers quickened their pace, staying just far enough behind to avoid detection. Their plan was forming spontaneously, the way teenage mischief often does. They had no real malicious intent, but their privileged upbringing had left them without a proper understanding of consequences or respect for others. Rex's training had prepared him for many situations, but what was about to unfold would test both his abilities and his loyalty to Marcus in ways that neither of them could have anticipated. The peaceful neighborhood street was about to become the setting for an incident that would ripple far beyond this single afternoon. Marcus paused at the crosswalk, waiting for the signal to change. Rex sat obediently beside him, alert and ready to guide his handler safely across the busy intersection. Neither of them knew that they were being watched by young people who were about to make a series of very poor decisions. The teenagers had smartphones, social media accounts, and a misguided sense of entertainment that would soon put them in direct conflict with someone who had already given more for his country than they could possibly understand. The stage was set for a confrontation that would teach everyone involved some very important lessons about respect, consequences, and the power of brotherhood among those who have served. The next day started like any other for Marcus and Rex. Their morning routine was precise and comforting in its predictability. After breakfast, they headed to the nearby park where Rex could have some exercise and Marcus could enjoy the fresh air and sounds of nature. The park had become their sanctuary, a place where they could both relax and enjoy some peace away from the busy streets. As they settled onto their usual bench under the large oak tree, Marcus heard familiar voices approaching. The same group of teenagers from yesterday had spotted them again. This time, however, their intentions were more focused and considerably less innocent than mere curiosity. Jake pulled out his phone and started recording as the group moved closer. "This is going to be hilarious," he whispered to his friends. "Watch this." The other teenagers gathered around, eager to see what their leader had planned. Their expensive clothes and confident smirks showed they felt completely untouchable, protected by their family's wealth and social status. Marcus was completely unaware of their presence as he gently stroked Rex's fur. The dog was enjoying the attention from his handler, his tail wagging softly as Marcus spoke to him in quiet, encouraging tones. The bond between them was evident to anyone watching, but the teenagers interpreted this connection as weakness rather than strength. Without warning, Jake threw a small rock in Rex's direction. The stone didn't hit the dog, but it landed close enough to startle him. Rex immediately went into protective mode, positioning himself between Marcus and the source of the disturbance. His training kicked in as he assessed the potential threat to his handler. "What's wrong, boy?" Marcus asked, immediately sensing Rex's change in posture and alertness. The dog's body language told him that something was wrong, but he couldn't determine what had caused the shift in his companion's behavior. The teenagers found this reaction amusing. They began throwing small objects near the pair, not directly at them, but close enough to keep Rex on edge. Each throw was accompanied by stifled laughter and whispered comments about how easy it was to mess with a blind person's dog. Marcus tried to calm Rex, but the dog's training told him to remain vigilant. The constant low-level harassment was designed to be just subtle enough that Marcus couldn't pinpoint the source of the problem, but persistent enough to keep Rex in a state of alert confusion. "Let's see if we can get the dog to leave him," suggested Sarah, one of the girls in the group. She pulled out a bag of expensive dog treats that she had bought specifically for this purpose. The teenagers had actually planned this encounter, spending money and time to orchestrate their harassment of a military veteran. They began calling to Rex softly, trying to lure him away from Marcus with treats and friendly voices. Rex's training was strong, but the constant distractions and the appealing smell of high-quality treats created an internal conflict for the intelligent animal. Marcus knew something was definitely wrong now. Rex's behavior was becoming increasingly agitated, and the veteran's military instincts were telling him that they were being deliberately targeted. He had developed heightened awareness of his surroundings since losing his sight, and every sense was now alerting him to potential danger. "Come here, Doggy," whispered one of the teenagers, shaking the treat bag just loud enough for Rex to hear. The dog's ears perked up, but his training held firm. He would not abandon his handler, no matter how appealing the distraction might be. The harassment continued for nearly 20 minutes. The teenagers took turns creating small disturbances, recording everything on their phones and treating the entire situation like a game. They had no understanding of what Rex meant to Marcus or how their actions were affecting both the veteran and his service animal. Marcus finally stood up, his jaw set with determination. "I know someone is there," he said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded troops in combat. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to stop now." The teenagers fell silent for a moment, surprised by the strength in Marcus's voice. They had expected him to remain passive and confused, not to confront them directly. Jake motioned for the others to be quiet, but their silence only confirmed to Marcus that his suspicions were correct. Rex remained at Marcus's side, his professional training overriding the confusion caused by the deliberate harassment. The dog's loyalty was absolute, but the stress of the situation was taking its toll on the intelligent animal, who couldn't understand why these strangers were making his job so difficult. The teenagers exchanged glances, realizing that their victim was more aware than they had anticipated. However, instead of backing down, they decided to escalate their harassment. They had no idea that their actions were being observed by others in the park, or that word of their behavior was about to reach people who would not find their entertainment amusing at all. The third day brought the most disturbing escalation yet. The teenagers had grown bolder after getting away with their previous harassment. They had shared the videos on their private social media accounts, laughing with friends who encouraged them to do something even more dramatic for their entertainment. Marcus and Rex were walking to the post office when the group spotted them again. This time they had brought more elaborate supplies for their harassment campaign. Jake carried a remote-controlled toy car, while Sarah had a small laser pointer that she thought would be funny to shine near Rex's eyes. They had no understanding that such devices could permanently damage a service animal's vision. The attack began as soon as Marcus and Rex turned down the quieter side street. The remote-controlled car came racing toward Rex's feet, making loud electronic noises designed to startle and confuse the service dog. Rex jumped aside, his training telling him to protect Marcus while also trying to understand this new type of threat. Marcus immediately knew they were under deliberate attack. "Rex, steady," he commanded, using the firm voice that helped his dog focus during stressful situations. But the harassment was becoming too complex and overwhelming for even the well-trained German Shepherd to handle effectively. The teenagers thought this was the funniest thing they had ever done. They took turns operating the toy car, chasing Rex's feet while recording everything on their phones. The laser pointer added another layer of confusion, as Sarah aimed the red dot around the area where Marcus and Rex were trying to walk. What the teenagers didn't realize was that Mrs. Patricia Williams, a retired school principal, was watching everything from her front window. She had noticed the same group bothering Marcus and Rex on previous days, and today's escalated harassment filled her with anger and determination to help. Mrs. Williams had 3 sons who had served in the military, and she understood the sacrifice that veterans like Marcus had made. She also knew that interfering with a service animal was not just morally wrong but also illegal in their state. She picked up her phone and began recording the teenagers' behavior, while simultaneously calling the police. Meanwhile, the harassment continued to intensify. One of the boys threw a handful of gravel near Rex's feet, causing the dog to jump and nearly lose his careful positioning beside Marcus. The veteran stumbled slightly, catching himself before falling but clearly shaken by the deliberate attempt to separate him from his guide. "That's enough," Marcus shouted, his military training evident in the commanding tone of his voice. "I'm a United States Marine veteran, and you are interfering with my service animal. That's a federal crime, and you need to stop immediately." The teenagers paused for a moment, but instead of backing down, they became more aggressive. Jake stepped closer, his phone still recording. "What are you going to do about it, blind man? You can't even see us." This taunt crossed a line that changed everything. Rex sensed the direct threat to his handler and moved into a more protective stance. The dog's training included protection protocols, and the aggressive approach and verbal threat triggered his defensive instincts. Mrs. Williams had heard enough. She burst out of her front door, her phone still recording as she marched toward the group. "You should be ashamed of yourselves," she declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades disciplining unruly children. "I have called the police and I have video evidence of everything you've been doing." The teenagers were shocked by the sudden appearance of an adult witness. They had assumed their harassment was happening without any oversight, and the presence of Mrs. Williams immediately changed the dynamic of the situation. But the damage was already done. Rex was showing signs of severe stress from days of targeted harassment. His training was being undermined by the constant, unpredictable attacks on his ability to guide and protect Marcus. The dog's confidence was shaking, and Marcus could sense his companion's distress. "You kids get away from here right now," Mrs. Williams continued, positioning herself between the teenagers and Marcus. "What you're doing is not just cruel, it's illegal. That man served our country, and you're attacking his service dog." The teenagers began to back away, but their retreat was sullen rather than apologetic. They had been caught, but they didn't yet understand the serious consequences that were about to unfold. Jake kept his phone recording, still thinking this was all just an entertaining game that had gotten slightly out of hand. Marcus knelt down to comfort Rex, speaking softly to his partner while trying to assess the psychological damage that had been done. The dog was trembling slightly, his usual calm confidence replaced by anxiety and confusion. The bond between them was strong, but even the best training could be undermined by sustained psychological harassment. Mrs. Williams approached Marcus carefully, introducing herself and explaining what she had witnessed. "I've been watching them target you for 3 days now," she said gently. "I have video evidence and the police are on their way. These kids need to learn that actions have consequences." The sound of approaching sirens could be heard in the distance, but this was only the beginning of the story. Word of the teenagers' behavior was about to reach ears that would take their actions much more seriously than local law enforcement. Marcus had brothers in arms who would not stand by quietly when one of their own was being targeted. When the police arrived, they took the situation very seriously. Officer Maria Rodriguez had experience with service animal laws and immediately understood the gravity of what had occurred. She collected Mrs. Williams' video evidence and took detailed statements from both witnesses while the teenagers waited uncomfortably nearby. The 5 young people suddenly realized that their entertainment had serious legal implications. Interfering with a service animal was indeed a federal crime, and their recorded harassment could result in significant penalties. Their confident smirks disappeared as Officer Rodriguez explained the charges they were potentially facing. Jake's father, a prominent lawyer, arrived within 30 minutes of being called. David Morrison had built his career defending wealthy clients, but as he listened to the evidence against his son, his expression grew increasingly grim. The video footage clearly showed deliberate harassment of a disabled veteran and his service animal. "Dad, it was just a joke," Jake protested, but his father silenced him with a sharp look. David Morrison knew that this case could destroy his son's future and potentially damage his own legal reputation. The evidence was overwhelming, and the victim was a decorated Marine veteran. Meanwhile, word of the incident was spreading through channels that the teenagers never could have anticipated. Mrs. Williams had recognized Marcus from a local newspaper article about veteran services and remembered that he was connected to the Marine Veterans Association downtown. She called the association directly, speaking to Tom Bradley, a Vietnam veteran who served as the organization's president. When Tom heard what had happened to Marcus, his reaction was immediate and decisive. He began making phone calls to every Marine veteran in the city, explaining the situation and asking for their help. The Marine Corps motto Semper Fidelis means always faithful, and that loyalty extends far beyond active duty. Within hours, dozens of Marine veterans knew about the harassment of their brother-in-arms and his service dog. Their response was swift and coordinated. Marcus had no idea that his fellow Marines were mobilizing on his behalf. He was at home, trying to help Rex recover from the stress of the sustained harassment. The dog was still showing signs of anxiety, and Marcus was deeply concerned about the damage that had been done to his partner's confidence and training. The teenagers, meanwhile, were discovering that their actions had consequences beyond legal charges. The video evidence had been shared with the police, but word of their behavior was also reaching their school administration, their parents' employers, and their social circles. Sarah's mother, Patricia Henderson, was a prominent figure in local charity organizations. When she learned about her daughter's involvement in harassing a disabled veteran, she was horrified. The family's reputation in the community was built on their charitable work and public service, and Sarah's actions threatened to destroy years of carefully cultivated goodwill. By evening, all 5 sets of parents had been contacted by the police and informed about the charges their children were facing. The families quickly realized that this was not a simple case of teenage mischief that could be resolved with apologies and community service. David Morrison began researching federal laws regarding service animal interference, and what he found made him deeply worried. The penalties could include significant fines and even jail time, especially given the sustained and premeditated nature of the harassment. His son's college applications and future career prospects were now in serious jeopardy. The parents held an emergency meeting that night, trying to figure out how to handle the situation. They discussed hiring the best lawyers available and potentially offering financial compensation to Marcus. But they were all beginning to understand that money might not be enough to resolve this problem. What none of them knew was that the Marine veterans were planning their own response to the situation. Tom Bradley had organized a meeting for the following evening, and more than 50 veterans had already committed to attending. These were men and women who had served their country with honor, and they were not going to let the harassment of one of their own go unanswered. The teenagers spent a sleepless night realizing that their privileged backgrounds might not protect them from the consequences of their actions. They had targeted someone they thought was vulnerable, not understanding that Marines never abandon their fellow warriors, even after their service has ended. Marcus tried to sleep, but Rex's continued anxiety kept both of them awake. The dog's distress was heartbreaking to witness, and Marcus felt a deep anger building within him. Rex had served faithfully and deserved better than to be traumatized by thoughtless teenagers who had never learned respect for others. The next morning would bring developments that none of the participants in this drama could have anticipated. The Marine veterans were not planning violence or revenge, but they were determined to ensure that justice was served and that Marcus and Rex received the respect and protection they deserved. The teenagers had awakened something much larger than themselves, and their privileged bubble was about to be confronted with the reality of what it means to attack someone under the protection of the United States Marine Corps Brotherhood. The Marine Veterans Association meeting that evening was unlike anything the community had seen before. More than 70 former Marines filled the small meeting hall, representing decades of service and every major conflict since Vietnam. These were not angry vigilantes, but disciplined veterans who understood the power of organized, lawful action. Tom Bradley stood before the assembled Marines and laid out the facts of Marcus's harassment. He showed Mrs. Williams video evidence and explained the psychological damage that had been done to Rex. The room fell silent as the veterans absorbed the details of how one of their own had been targeted. Brothers and sisters, Tom said, his voice carrying the weight of years of military service. We have a Marine who has been attacked not by enemy combatants, but by spoiled children who think disability makes someone an easy target. We're going to show this community what happens when you mess with one of ours. The response was immediate and decisive. The veterans began organizing a comprehensive campaign to support Marcus and ensure that the teenagers faced appropriate consequences. They formed committees to handle different aspects of their response: legal support, community outreach, media relations, and direct assistance to Marcus. Retired Colonel James Walsh, who had connections throughout the legal system, volunteered to coordinate with prosecutors to ensure the case received proper attention. Staff Sergeant Linda Martinez, who worked in public relations, began crafting a media strategy to tell Marcus's story and highlight the broader issues facing disabled veterans. Meanwhile, the teenagers and their families were discovering that their legal troubles were only the beginning of their problems. The story had reached local news outlets, and reporters were asking uncomfortable questions about privileged teens targeting a disabled veteran. Jake's father realized that his usual legal strategies would not work in this case. The evidence was overwhelming, the victim was sympathetic, and public opinion was turning strongly against the teenagers. More importantly, he was learning about the organized response from the Marine veterans, and he knew that fighting against such a motivated and disciplined group would be futile. The next morning, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. Tom Bradley arrived at his apartment with 2 other Marine veterans, introducing themselves and explaining what the Marine community was doing to support him. Marcus was overwhelmed by the show of solidarity from his fellow veterans. "You don't fight alone, Marine," Tom said simply. "Never have, never will. We're going to make sure this gets handled properly, and we're going to make sure you and Rex get whatever help you need." The veterans had already arranged for Rex to be evaluated by a specialist in service animal psychology. They were prepared to cover all costs for any additional training or therapy that might be needed to restore the dog's confidence and effectiveness as a guide animal. Meanwhile, the parents of the teenagers were beginning to understand that their children's actions had consequences, far beyond anything they had imagined. The Marine veterans were not seeking revenge, but they were determined to ensure that justice was served and that their community learned from this incident. Patricia Henderson received a phone call from her main charity organization, informing her that her involvement would be suspended pending the resolution of her daughter's case. Sarah's actions had reflected poorly on the entire organization, and they could not afford to be associated with the harassment of a disabled veteran. The other parents were facing similar consequences in their professional and social circles. Word of their children's behavior was spreading throughout the community, and the family reputations that had taken years to build were crumbling in a matter of days. The teenagers themselves were beginning to understand the gravity of their situation. Their phones had been confiscated as evidence. Their college applications were in jeopardy, and they were facing potential criminal charges that could follow them for the rest of their lives. Jake, who had been the ringleader of the harassment, was struggling with the realization that his actions had real consequences. His privileged upbringing had never taught him that other people's pain mattered, and he was finally being forced to confront the harm he had caused. The Marine veterans, meanwhile, were planning something that would surprise everyone involved. Rather than simply pursuing punishment for the teenagers, they were organizing a comprehensive educational initiative that would benefit the entire community. Tom Bradley announced that the Marines would be hosting a community forum on veteran issues, service animals, and disability awareness. They were inviting local schools, businesses, and organizations to participate in a program designed to prevent future incidents like the harassment of Marcus and Rex. The veterans understood that true victory would come not from destroying the teenagers' lives, but from creating lasting change that would protect other disabled veterans from similar treatment. They were planning to turn this negative incident into a powerful force for positive community education. The teenagers and their families were about to learn that the Marines' response would be more sophisticated and impactful than anything they could have imagined. The brotherhood that had protected Marcus was about to teach the entire community some very important lessons about respect, service, and the true meaning of strength. The Marine Veterans Association meeting that evening was unlike anything the community had seen before. More than 70 former Marines filled the small meeting hall, representing decades of service and every major conflict since Vietnam. These were not angry vigilantes, but disciplined veterans who understood the power of organized, lawful action. Tom Bradley stood before the assembled Marines and laid out the facts of Marcus's harassment. He showed Mrs. Williams video evidence and explained the psychological damage that had been done to Rex. The room fell silent as the veterans absorbed the details of how one of their own had been targeted. Brothers and sisters, Tom said, his voice carrying the weight of years of military service. We have a Marine who has been attacked not by enemy combatants, but by spoiled children who think disability makes someone an easy target. We're going to show this community what happens when you mess with one of ours. The response was immediate and decisive. The veterans began organizing a comprehensive campaign to support Marcus and ensure that the teenagers faced appropriate consequences. They formed committees to handle different aspects of their response: legal support, community outreach, media relations, and direct assistance to Marcus. Retired Colonel James Walsh, who had connections throughout the legal system, volunteered to coordinate with prosecutors to ensure the case received proper attention. Staff Sergeant Linda Martinez, who worked in public relations, began crafting a media strategy to tell Marcus's story and highlight the broader issues facing disabled veterans. Meanwhile, the teenagers and their families were discovering that their legal troubles were only the beginning of their problems. The story had reached local news outlets, and reporters were asking uncomfortable questions about privileged teens targeting a disabled veteran. Jake's father realized that his usual legal strategies would not work in this case. The evidence was overwhelming, the victim was sympathetic, and public opinion was turning strongly against the teenagers. More importantly, he was learning about the organized response from the Marine veterans, and he knew that fighting against such a motivated and disciplined group would be futile. The next morning, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. Tom Bradley arrived at his apartment with 2 other Marine veterans, introducing themselves and explaining what the Marine community was doing to support him. Marcus was overwhelmed by the show of solidarity from his fellow veterans. "You don't fight alone, Marine," Tom said simply. "Never have, never will. We're going to make sure this gets handled properly, and we're going to make sure you and Rex get whatever help you need." The veterans had already arranged for Rex to be evaluated by a specialist in service animal psychology. They were prepared to cover all costs for any additional training or therapy that might be needed to restore the dog's confidence and effectiveness as a guide animal. Meanwhile, the parents of the teenagers were beginning to understand that their children's actions had consequences, far beyond anything they had imagined. The Marine veterans were not seeking revenge, but they were determined to ensure that justice was served and that their community learned from this incident. Patricia Henderson received a phone call from her main charity organization, informing her that her involvement would be suspended pending the resolution of her daughter's case. Sarah's actions had reflected poorly on the entire organization, and they could not afford to be associated with the harassment of a disabled veteran. The other parents were facing similar consequences in their professional and social circles. Word of their children's behavior was spreading throughout the community, and the family reputations that had taken years to build were crumbling in a matter of days. The teenagers themselves were beginning to understand the gravity of their situation. Their phones had been confiscated as evidence. Their college applications were in jeopardy, and they were facing potential criminal charges that could follow them for the rest of their lives. Jake, who had been the ringleader of the harassment, W,